Hey guys, welcome to the third Les Miserables editorial, where I offer unscripted commentary on some of the book's content. Now, seeing as the last chapter we read was The Descent, which detailed Fantine's descent into poverty and prostitution, I figured now would be a good time to talk about feminism and how it relates to Les Miserables. Or rather, how it relates in Les Miserables. So let's not beat around the bush anymore. Let's just start. This is kind of a loaded topic, so I'm probably going to, talk a lot. I'll try to be coherent. So, as every feminist knows, there are two basic forms of sexism in media. There's the more negative sexism, where women are treated to all sorts of slurs and are called, nagging harpies, bitter, wrathful bitches, sluts, etc., etc., etc. Negative slurs that portray women as being inferior, at least more difficult, more irrational, hysterical, all sorts of bad things in relation to men, and all women are this way. The other side of sexism is a little less obvious and is actually more common, which I like to call idealizing sexism, which is where women are portrayed as being smarter than men, more level-headed than men, more capable than men, and in general more attractive physically than men, which is odd. Actually, not odd at all, because most writers are male, so to them, probably women look more attractive. And, this is pretty common in media. If you look at, just really common stuff that everybody watches, The Simpsons, most sitcoms, actually, I noticed in Adventure Time, when Finn is gender-bended into Fiona, he becomes more level-headed. Women are portrayed as being smarter, better in general. Now, while this is probably less sexist and is certainly less negative, it's still a little frustrating for a lot of feminists because it still portrays women as, writers have to write women a specific certain way as opposed to men. And it still treats men as the default gender, which statistically it is not. I mean, it's pretty much 50-50. So there isn't really a default gender, which is the main thing of feminism, that there is no default. Men and women are equal. So those are the two kinds, negative and idealizing. Les Miserables doesn't seem to have either of those. Now, when I say that, what I mean is that women in general in this book are not portrayed as being better than men. They're also not portrayed as being worse than men. They are, however, portrayed as being different. And in what ways? Let's talk about it. First of all, there are three main female characters that everybody talks about when they talk about feminism, Les Miserables. Those three are Fantine, Cosette, and little Eponine, who is not that little, is actually the same age as Cosette. And those three are the main ones people focus on. Now, those three are probably good that people talk about them, because they are three main characters. There are tons and tons of characters, and if you look at this thing, it's 1,400 pages. That's 1,400 pages worth of characters, and a lot of them are female. So aside from those three, there are a lot more, but people talk about those three mostly because they have prominent roles in the musical, and people in general are more familiar with the musical than with the book. Those three are three very different, they're three very different individuals, and they're three different places in the spectrum, I guess, of femininity. Out of the three, Cosette is consistently presented as the most problematic. Why? Well, when she's sort of, I think the biggest problem people have with Cosette is her passivity. Cosette is a very feminine person. When she grows up, she turns into this absolute beauty of a woman, and that's portrayed as being really desirable. She actually represents a feminine ideal at the time when this was written in France, and you could tell volumes about what this says about French society. She's very beautiful, she's very agreeable, very passive. There's not really an unpleasant thing about her, and a lot of people view that as sexist because she's more of an idol than an actual person. Fantine and Eponine, however, are much more warmly represented. more warmly received by most feminists because they have what might be called more well-rounded personalities, and they put up with more adversity. So that's what most people see about feminism. Now, here's sort of my take on how Victor Hugo presents it. Another form of sexism, besides the two, that actually fits into the former, the more negative side of the two categories you listed, is judging women based on how many people they have sex with. You know, the old prude versus slut thing. And Victor Hugo absolutely does not do that. There is no judgment based on how many people that a woman has banged, to put it in strictly kind of crude terms. Fantine becomes a prostitute and is absolutely, like, even before she was that, she took a lover and had a kid with him before she was married. And Victor Hugo says that her love is the thing that her life hungered for, you know? And he doesn't say that at all negatively. And when her lover just leaves her, which is a scene I haven't read because it's in the Brick, it's portrayed as very sad. Fantine is presented as being a victim of her society, where she was forced to do something that she didn't want. She was forced to sell her body because she had to make ends meet. And yeah, Jean Valjean pretty much says that she has never ceased to be virtuous and holy, basically, in God's eyes, even though she's been doing things that a lot of people at the time, and even in story, were decrying as immoral. So the idea that you can have sex with a bunch of people but still be virtuous before God is one that I am willing to bet was not the mainstream idea in 19th century France at all. Hell, it's not even the mainstream idea nowadays. So there's that. There's also a lot of women who have never taken any lovers at all. And they aren't portrayed any more negatively or positively than any other. What I really like about Les Miserables is that it takes there's a full spectrum aspect, both on morality for all characters and on morality for the female ones. Just because you're a female character doesn't guarantee whether you will be a positive or negative character. Like, Madame Thénardier is one of the main villains. Again, I said the word villain is iffy in Les Miserables, but one of the main villains, and she is not only a woman, but she's a mother of several kids. There are other female characters who are much more positive, like Fantine, Cosette, and, many more. And then there are other female characters who don't do much, and they're just sort of there. There are lots of characters in this book. Now, one of the weak points, I think, of Victor Hugo's feminism is that he was born, he did live, almost 200 years ago. And so there are a few snags, probably just as a result of the time period he lived in, where, from a modern perspective, it might be a little sexist, but it probably wasn't sexist at the time. There's one part in The Brick where Jean Valjean gives Cosette her doll, Catherine, and Cosette is just delighted to finally get a real toy. And Victor Hugo kind of goes on this sort of spiel about how all little girls should have dolls, because a doll will nurture a little girl's motherhood instinct, and all little girls secretly yearn to be mothers. And a lot of modern people, including me, would read that and say, that's a little sexist. Like, the idea that all women are supposed to be one certain thing is troublesome. Especially if it's something like motherhood, which sort of has, it shouldn't have, but sort of has negative connotations in today, where we have really heated debates that I'm not going to take a side on here about things like abortion and birth control and that kind of thing. So motherhood has sort of acquired a modern day negative connotation that it has never had before. But what's interesting is that even though Victor Hugo says that all women have the instinct to be mothers, if you look at the story, not all of the women in Les Miserables are mothers. In fact, the vast majority of them are not. Cosette, even though she's married at the end of the book, is still not a mother by the end. In fact, I don't think it even mentions if she was expecting or not. Which is interesting, because a lot of classic books have the babies ever after happy ending, where, the the two people get married and they have a kid, and they usually name the kid after somebody who died. Dracula, I remember, ended that way. Dracula, of all novels, had a baby ever after ending. But Les Miserables doesn't. And Cosette is one of the most, maybe not virtuous, well, maybe virtuous, I don't know. One of the most positive female characters, and she's not a mother by the end. Eponine is not a mother. There's one character who I absolutely love, who is not in the abridged version, who is a nun, who is really helpful to Jean Valjean. She's not a mother, because she's a nun. She can't be. So, yeah. And there's at least one character, Madame Thénardier, who, her being a mother, doesn't save her from not being a terrible person. I mean, granted, her motherhood is treated as, her only redeeming characteristic, but I think that's just because in Les Miserables, love overall is more redeeming. Jean Valjean finds true purpose in his life through love of Cosette. And similarly, some other characters, such as Thénardier and Javert, in their own unique ways, are beyond saving because they can't comprehend love. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a snag there. Victor Hugo does view women as fundamentally different from men, and that is a problem from a modern perspective. I see that as a problem. But for the most part, when you compare it to what other people were writing in his day, this was really good. Based on what I know about 19th century society, it's pretty likely that misogyny was pretty prominent. The more casual stay in the kitchen variety of misogyny was probably common at the time. And there is misogyny in Les Miserables, in the context of the story. There are male characters who are misogynists, and they are always portrayed negatively. Or at the very least, their misogynistic tendencies are portrayed negatively. There's the dandy in the chapter that I just read who throws snow at Cosette, Fantine, who is described by the narrators being one of those useless people, and one of their traits is that they despise women. It says that they do no good and not much harm. So yeah, not a very flattering portrayal of misogynist. Another character who has misogynistic tendencies, interestingly enough, is Javert, who seems rather harsh on Fantine because she's a prostitute, I guess, and calls her unflattering names like hussy and girl, even though looks like she's in her 40s by the time she dies. She wasn't, but Javert didn't have any way of knowing that. The 1998 did notice this tendency, and they kicked it up a bit, and yeah, it was portrayed negatively too. It's part of, I think, Javert's misguided ideas that he views women more harshly or more unflatteringly. And there's probably other examples that I just can't think of right now. But yeah, the hatred of women is portrayed as negative, where a more adoration of women, is shown by one of the friends of the ABC, is more positive. Les Miserables, I read on a helpful introduction, the beginning of this book, which does get some things about the story wrong, but which did have a very helpful fact that Les Miserables is one of the defining works of literature for the Romantic period in fiction. And when it says one of the things that was influenced in Romanticism was giving a literary voice to groups that had no voice before. That included the poor lower classes, and that included women. So this book does have a good high emphasis, especially at the time, for giving a voice to women. And that voice, I think, is heard in the injustices that women had to go through and the strength of a lot of the female characters. So we're back down to the main problem I think that most people have when they talk about if they want to point to Les Miserables as being sexist, is I always come back to Cosette. Because, okay, let me reiterate this for a second. There's this old saying, there's this trope on TV tropes that discuss double standards in fiction. There's a whole lot of double standard tropes in TV tropes, actually. There's a whole list. And one of them is they talk about the idea that men act and women are. Which that men are more proactive generally in fiction. Women are prone to just sit around and just be, like a woman just existing. And not really doing anything is more common. The women in Les Miserables overall are actually very proactive. Fantine works so hard every day to support her child. And, like, yeah, she becomes a prostitute, she gets this job here, she sells all her hair and her teeth, and she works really hard to, try to save Cosette. Eponine is, a very complicated character, and I will talk about her in a later editorial, but she is also very proactive. She goes to great steps to try to get Marius, or if not to get Marius, at least to prevent him from being with Cosette. She sneaks around on her own. She sneaks to the barricade on her own. She actually saves Marius's life by taking a bullet for him. That's awesome. There's this one female character I mentioned already who's a nun, Sister Simplice in the Brick, who actually is one of the people who helps Jean Valjean escape. She lies to Javert, saying that and is able to throw him off the track to allow Jean Valjean to get away. Now I'm going to repeat that, because it bears repeating. A nun lied to a cop to help a convict escape. That's badass. And if you read the narration on that scene, Victor Hugo absolutely agrees. Like, that's awesome. But again, we sort of run into a snag with Cosette, who is very passive, who waits at the inn for someone to rescue her, who waits around at her home for Jean Valjean to come back, who is totally helpless when her father wants to move away to stay with Marius. But here's the thing. Not every character needs to be totally proactive all the time. And yeah, Cosette's a female character who's more passive, but some women are more passive. And to be fair, Cosette is not the only character who sits around the house. Marius' grandfather, I don't think there's a single point in the entire book, or at least not in this abridged version I have, where he steps outside of his home, right? He's an old man, he just sits around waiting for Marius to come back. So, and I'll talk later, he actually shows tsundere tendencies. So I don't think Cosette sits around the house because she's a woman. Granted, sitting around the house by yourself, being a feminine ideal, probably says something about society. But I don't think I think it's just her personality. Like, maybe there is some sexism there, but it's like, there are male characters who do the same thing, and who are positive characters. And besides, in her own little way, Cosette is somewhat proactive. She does encourage her father to go out in public more because she wants to see Marius more often. And she does go out by herself to wait for him in the garden, not knowing whether or not he'll be there. And so, yeah, she doesn't do anything as dramatic as hold aloft a sword or defend the barricade or save someone from a bullet like Eponine does. But, not every person needs to be strong in that way. Like, there's one point where Jean Valjean is running away from Javert and he drags Cosette along with him. And the narration says that any other kid would have started loudly complaining long before. But Cosette is mostly very quiet throughout. In fact, it's only like half an hour into the chase that she thinks to ask Jean Valjean, "Papa, I'm scared. What are we running from?" So Cosette can be interpreted as being very strong and that she's very durable. And that she's able to take a lot of abuse without saying anything. That sort of fits into, I think, the Yamamoto Nadeshiko, if I pronounce that right, Japanese ideal of a woman who is strong but quiet. But, since there are other female characters who don't fit that, Cosette is still very positive, and I think much stronger than most people give her credit for. Not every woman needs to be holding a sword. Not every woman needs to be a soldier. Sometimes just being there and being a support for someone you love is enough. And while it is cool that we are seeing more women nowadays that are stronger and participate more and more proactive, saying that all women need to be strong in a specific way is sort of problematic because it runs into that same sexism problem of all women need to be a certain way, which is not true at all. As we see in this book, and as we see in real life, a woman can be many different things. She can be a soldier, teacher, lawyer, doctor, or just, if she wants, just a mother. She can be a lot of stuff. Need I remind you that third wave feminism says that there's nothing wrong with being girly. It's only when you're being girly against your will, or being forced into a certain position, that there are problems. Are there a few sexism snags in Les Miserables? Sure, I've named a few. Does Victor Hugo view women as being different from men? Sure. But do I think that Les Miserables still has a lot of strong female characters and a strong emphasis on feminism overall? Absolutely. Thank you for listening.
Did you see them lying where they died? Someone used to cradle them and kiss them when they cried. Did you see them lying side by side?